When we talk about the universe, we usually imagine something vast and distant, galaxies spinning billions of light years away, stars being born and dying long before humans ever existed. In this picture, the human brain feels tiny, almost irrelevant, a fragile biological machine on a small planet orbiting an average star. For centuries, science reinforced the separation, the universe out there, the mind in here. But modern physics quietly shattered that comfortable boundary, and it did so without intending to. Because when physicists looked closely enough at reality, they discovered something unsettling. The universe does not behave as if it exists independently of observation. At the deepest level we can measure, reality seems to respond to being observed. This is where the idea of quantum consciousness begins, not as mysticism, but as a consequence of experiments that refuse to behave intuitively. To understand why this question even exists, is the universe aware of you, we must begin with something very ordinary: measurement. In everyday life, measuring something feels passive. You check the temperature, weigh an object, or look at the sky. Nothing changes because you looked. But in the quantum world, measurement is not passive, it is active. When scientists measure a quantum system like an electron, they don't just reveal a hidden property, they force the system to choose a definite state. Before measurement, the electron exists in a spread of possibilities, mathematically described as a wave. After measurement, it snaps into a single outcome. This transition is called wave function collapse, and it is one of the most mysterious processes in all of science. Here's the strange part. Physics has equations that perfectly describe how quantum waves evolve over time, but there is no equation that explains collapse. It simply happens when an observation occurs. This bothered even the founders of quantum mechanics. Niels Bohr argued that measurement requires a classical observer. John von Neumann took it further and showed that measuring devices themselves are also quantum systems. If everything is quantum, then where does collapse really occur? His answer was radical for its time. Collapse happens when the information reaches consciousness. In other words, the chain of quantum interactions only stops when a conscious observer becomes aware of the result. This idea was not spiritual, it was logical and deeply disturbing. At first, many physicists dismissed consciousness as an unnecessary complication. Surely the universe doesn't need minds to exist. And yet, decades later, experiments kept reinforcing the same uncomfortable pattern. The famous double-slit experiment shows that particles behave like waves when unobserved and like particles when observed. Even more unsettling, delayed choice experiments show that decisions made in the present can determine how particles behaved in the past. Not metaphorically, the data literally changes depending on whether information is available to an observer. Reality seems less like a solid object and more like a negotiation between possibilities and knowledge. This forces a question science never wanted to ask: what role does awareness play in shaping the universe? Now consider consciousness itself. The brain is not a simple on-off machine. It is a dynamic, self-organizing system with billions of neurons exchanging electrical and chemical signals. But here's a weird fact rarely mentioned. Neurons operate at scales where quantum effects should be negligible, yet some biological processes already rely on quantum mechanics. Photosynthesis uses quantum coherence to achieve near-perfect efficiency. Birds navigate using quantum entanglement in their eyes. Even your sense of smell may rely on quantum tunneling. Nature, it turns out, is not afraid of quantum weirdness, so the idea that the brain might exploit quantum processes is no longer absurd, it's plausible. This brings us to one of the most controversial theories linking consciousness to the fabric of reality, the OR theory proposed by physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. They suggest that consciousness does not arise from neurons firing alone, but from quantum processes occurring inside microtubules, tiny structures within neurons. According to this view, moments of conscious awareness are tied to objective reductions of quantum states, influenced by the fundamental geometry of space-time itself. In simple terms, your thoughts may be linked to the deepest structure of the universe.
Penrose didn't arrive at this idea through mysticism. He arrived there because he believed human understanding cannot be explained by computation alone. Something non-algorithmic, something fundamental, must be involved. If this sounds speculative, it is, but speculation at the frontier of science often begins this way. What makes it compelling is that it aligns with another radical idea gaining attention, that consciousness may be a fundamental property of reality, like mass or charge. This view, sometimes called panpsychism, does not claim rocks think like humans. Instead, it suggests that the universe has an intrinsic experiential aspect, and complex brains organize it into what we call awareness. If this is true, then consciousness does not emerge from the universe, it is woven into it. Your brain would not create consciousness, it would tune into it, much like a radio tunes into a signal that already exists.
This perspective flips the original question on its head. Instead of asking whether the brain connects to the universe, we ask whether the universe expresses itself through the brain. Some physicists have noted an eerie parallel here. The mathematical structure of quantum theory resembles information processing more than material objects. The universe, at its core, behaves less like a machine and more like a computation, or even a question asking itself what it is. In this context, awareness is not an accident. It is a way the universe looks back at itself. If consciousness is not merely a byproduct of brain activity, but something that interacts with reality at a fundamental level, then we are forced to reconsider what objective reality even means. Classical physics assumed a universe that exists independently of observers, like a stage on which events unfold. Quantum physics refuses to cooperate with that picture. Instead, it presents a universe that remains mathematically undefined until interaction occurs. This is not philosophical poetry, it is the literal outcome of equations that work with astonishing precision. The universe seems to operate on probabilities, not certainties, until knowledge enters the system. And knowledge, by definition, implies awareness. One of the strangest confirmations of this comes from quantum entanglement. When two particles become entangled, their properties are linked instantly, regardless of distance. Measure one, and the other responds immediately, even if it is light years away. Einstein famously called this spooky action at a distance, believing it revealed an incomplete theory. But decades of experiments, including Bell test experiments with increasingly strict controls, have shown that entanglement is real. No hidden variables, no classical explanation. What's deeply unsettling is that entanglement does not transmit matter or energy, only information. And information is not a physical object, it is relational. It exists only when something can know something else. This has led some physicists to propose that information, not matter, is the fundamental building block of reality. The phrase "it from bit," coined by physicist John Archibald Wheeler, captures this idea succinctly. According to Wheeler, every physical object, every "it," derives its meaning and existence from bits of information. Even more radically, Wheeler suggested that the universe is participatory. In his view, observers are not passive spectators, but active participants in the unfolding of reality. The universe, he argued, requires observation to bring its history into being. This implies something shocking. The past is not fully real until it is observed in the present. This is not speculation without evidence. Delayed choice quantum experiments demonstrate that decisions made now can determine how particles behaved then. In some setups, a photon appears to decide whether it behaved like a wave or a particle after it has already passed through an experimental apparatus. The universe behaves as if it is waiting for a question before deciding what answer it gave. Time, in this framework, stops being a fixed river flowing from past to future. Instead, it becomes something more flexible, almost conversational. Awareness doesn't just observe events in time, it helps define them. Now bring this back to the brain. The human brain is not just a biological organ, it is an information processing system capable of self-reference. You are not only aware of the universe, you are aware that you are aware. This recursive loop is unique, and it may be the key. Some neuroscientists suggest that consciousness arises when information becomes integrated and globally accessible. But quantum theorists point out something more unsettling. Self-reference creates logical paradoxes that classical systems cannot resolve. Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed that no sufficiently complex formal system can fully explain itself. Penrose used this to argue that human understanding cannot be purely computational. If he is correct, then consciousness taps into something non-computational, something that lies outside classical causality. This is where quantum processes re-enter the discussion.
Unlike classical systems, quantum systems can exist in superpositions and explore multiple possibilities simultaneously. If the brain can sustain even brief quantum coherence, it may gain access to non-classical modes of information processing. Critics argue that the brain is too warm and noisy for quantum coherence. Yet recent studies in quantum biology suggest otherwise. Coherence has been observed in biological systems at room temperature. Evolution, it seems, finds ways to preserve fragile quantum effects when they are useful. If consciousness depends on such effects, then awareness is not merely in the universe, it is using the universe at its deepest level. Here's a strange but important detail. When people lose consciousness under anesthesia, quantum coherence in microtubules may be disrupted. Hameroff has argued that anesthetics work not by shutting down neurons, but by interfering with quantum processes inside them. This would explain why consciousness disappears abruptly and returns just as abruptly, unlike memory or motor function, which degrade gradually. If true, then consciousness behaves less like a gradual chemical reaction and more like a phase transition. It is either on or off. That kind of behavior is typical of quantum systems, not classical ones. If awareness truly depends on quantum state reductions, then every conscious moment is tied to a fundamental event in spacetime. Penrose proposed that such reductions are linked to quantum gravity, something we do not yet understand. This would mean that each thought is, in a small but real sense, a negotiation with the geometry of the universe itself. Your experience would not be separate from cosmic structure, it would be one of its expressions. The universe would not merely contain minds, it would instantiate them.
And this leads to a deeply uncomfortable implication. If conscious observation plays a role in actualizing reality, then the universe without observers is not fully real. It exists only as a cloud of unrealized possibilities. This does not mean the universe was created by humans. It means that awareness, wherever and whenever it arises, completes the universe's story. Reality becomes something like a dialogue between what is possible and what is known. The universe is not finished, it is continuously becoming. If the universe is participatory, then awareness is not an accidental latecomer. It is a condition for reality to take shape. This idea quietly echoes through modern cosmology in ways most people never notice. Consider the early universe. According to inflation theory, the universe began in an incredibly smooth, almost perfectly uniform state. Yet today we see structure everywhere: galaxies, stars, planets, life. Where did the structure come from? The answer is quantum fluctuations. Tiny uncertainties in the quantum fields of the early universe were stretched by inflation into vast cosmic patterns. In other words, everything you see, the Milky Way, your body, your brain, originated from quantum indeterminacy. The universe grew by amplifying uncertainty into form. It did not begin as a finished object, it began as a question. Now, here is the disturbing part. Those quantum fluctuations were not things in the classical sense. They were probabilities, potentialities. They became real only when conditions allowed them to decohere into classical structures. Decoherence is often presented as a solution to the measurement problem, but it quietly avoids the deepest issue. Decoherence explains how quantum possibilities stop interfering with each other, but it does not explain why one outcome is experienced. Something still selects, something still actualizes, and that something looks suspiciously like awareness. This selection problem becomes unavoidable when we look at cosmology through the lens of quantum mechanics. The universe, taken as a whole, has no external observer. There's nothing outside it to collapse its wave function. Yet the universe clearly has a definite structure. Galaxies are here, not smeared across probability space. So what collapsed the universal wave function? Some physicists argue that decoherence alone is enough. Others are not convinced. Wheeler suggested something far more radical. The universe is self-observing. Observers arise within it, and by observing the universe, they retroactively define its past. In this view, consciousness is not downstream of cosmology. It is part of the mechanism by which cosmology becomes real.
This idea sounds outrageous until you realize something subtle. Every observation you make today relies on photons emitted millions or billions of years ago. When you look at a distant galaxy, you are not just seeing it, you are completing an interaction that began long before life existed on Earth. That photon carried information in a suspended state until it entered your eye, triggered a neural response, and became part of conscious experience. In a very literal sense, the universe waited. The past remained informationally incomplete until it was known. Awareness does not just live in the present, it reaches backward. Now think about time. In fundamental physics, time behaves very differently than in human experience. At the deepest level, many equations do not distinguish between past and future. Time symmetry is built into the laws of physics, yet consciousness experiences time as flowing, directional, irreversible. This asymmetry is not fully explained. Some physicists suspect that the arrow of time emerges from the act of observation itself. Each conscious moment selects one outcome from many possibilities, creating a record. Records accumulate, memory forms. Time, then, may not be a property of the universe alone, it may be a property of conscious interaction with the universe. This aligns with a strange result from quantum information theory. Information cannot be destroyed. Even when matter falls into a black hole, information is preserved in subtle correlations on the event horizon. This led to the holographic principle, which suggests that the information describing a volume of space is encoded on its boundary. The universe, according to this idea, is not a three-dimensional object in the way we intuitively think. It is more like a projection, a hologram. And consciousness? Consciousness may be the process by which that projection becomes experienced internally. Here is a rarely discussed implication. If reality is fundamentally informational, then the brain is not a generator of consciousness, but an interpreter of information. Your subjective experience would be the internal decoding of cosmic information structures. This would explain why mathematical laws describe reality so effectively. The universe behaves mathematically because it is mathematical at its core. Consciousness, then, is not outside this structure, it is a mode of access to it. Some researchers have pointed out something even stranger. The human brain operates near criticality, a phase transition between order and chaos. Systems at criticality are maximally sensitive to information. They are also capable of long-range correlations, similar to quantum entanglement. This is not coincidence. Systems poised at criticality can integrate information across scales. Your brain may be tuned by evolution to sit at the edge where the universe is most knowable. Not fully ordered, not fully random, balanced on the knife edge where meaning emerges.
And then there's self-awareness. Self-awareness is not required for intelligence. Many systems can process information without knowing that they do so. But humans experience something extra, the feeling of being an observer. This creates a loop. The universe observes itself, observing itself. From a logical standpoint, self-reference is unstable. It creates paradoxes. From a physical standpoint, it may create something else entirely, a point where the universe becomes locally aware of its own existence. Some physicists have speculated that consciousness is related to symmetry breaking. In physics, symmetry breaking is how simple laws produce complex structures. Ice crystals, galaxies, even particle masses arise this way. Consciousness may be a form of informational symmetry breaking, one perspective crystallizing out of many possibilities. If so, each conscious moment is a tiny act of cosmic differentiation. The universe, through you, chooses one way of being instead of infinitely many others. This brings us dangerously close to an idea science resists: meaning. Physics describes how things behave, not what they mean. Yet consciousness is saturated with meaning. Experiences are not neutral data points, they feel like something. This something it is like cannot be measured externally. It exists only from within. If consciousness is fundamental, then meaning is not an illusion layered onto a meaningless universe. Meaning is part of the universe's internal structure. The cosmos is not indifferent, it is incomplete without experience. At this depth, the original question, is the universe aware of you, may be wrongly framed.
Awareness may not be directional. The universe is not watching you like an external entity. Instead, awareness may be distributed, localized, and temporarily organized in forms like minds. You are not being observed by the universe. You are the universe observing itself from one particular angle, for one brief interval with limited information, but real experience. If awareness is the universe experiencing itself locally, then individuality becomes a kind of illusion, not false, but incomplete. You experience yourself as a separate observer because your information access is limited. Your brain only samples a tiny slice of the total informational structure of reality. Separation, then, is not fundamental, yet is a boundary condition. And boundaries in physics are not absolute, they are contextual. What appears separate at one scale becomes unified at another. Atoms blur into fields, particles blur into probabilities, space and time blur into space-time. And at the deepest level, even space itself may blur into something more abstract. Modern attempts at quantum gravity suggest that space-time itself is not fundamental. In some models, space emerges from patterns of entanglement. Distance is not primary, correlation is. 2 points in space are close if they are strongly entangled, and far if they are not. This means that the universe is not built out of space. Space is built out of relationships. If that is true, then consciousness, which is also relational, is not foreign to the universe's structure. It mirrors it. Your awareness binds information into a unified experience, just as entanglement binds distant regions of the universe into a coherent whole.
This parallel becomes even more unsettling when we examine the limits of objectivity. In quantum mechanics, there is no view from nowhere. Every measurement is made from a perspective. Even attempts to remove the observer mathematically end up smuggling one back in through boundary conditions or reference frames. Some physicists now openly admit that the dream of a completely observer-independent description of reality may be impossible. Reality may not exist without perspective, and perspective implies experience. Here is a strange but telling fact. The equations of physics describe relationships between quantities, but they never specify which quantities are real until an observation is made. The math evolves possibilities. Observation selects actuality. This selection is asymmetric. The equations do not care which outcome occurs, but experience does. Something prefers one outcome over another, not in a moral sense, but in the sense that only one becomes lived reality. This preference is not in the equations. It enters with awareness. This brings us to probability. Probability in physics is not just ignorance, it is ontological. Before measurement, outcomes are not merely unknown, they are undefined. This is radically different from classical uncertainty. And yet, when a conscious observer experiences an outcome, probability collapses into certainty. Not universally, only locally. Other observers may see different results until information is shared. Reality fragments, then realigns. This is not philosophy, this is how quantum experiments actually behave. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics try to escape this by proposing that all outcomes occur, branching into many worlds. In the many worlds interpretation, consciousness splits along with the universe, creating countless versions of you. But this does not eliminate consciousness, it multiplies it, and it introduces a deeper mystery. Why do you experience this branch and not the others? Probability returns through the back door as subjective experience. The problem is not solved, it is displaced. If consciousness selects a branch, then selection is real, and selection implies criteria. But where do those criteria come from? They're not encoded in physical law. This suggests that experience has an irreducible role. Reality does not merely happen, it is chosen, moment by moment, from within constraints. The universe behaves less like a machine executing instructions and more like a system exploring possibilities through awareness. This idea gains weight when we consider how finely tuned the universe appears to be. The constants of physics seem delicately balanced to allow complexity, chemistry, life, and consciousness. Some explain this through multiverses, others invoke anthropic reasoning, but a quieter possibility exists. The universe's laws are such that awareness can arise because awareness is part of what the universe does.
The cosmos is not optimized for life by accident. Life and awareness may be among its natural outcomes, like stars or gravity. At this level, the brain becomes less interesting as hardware and more interesting as an interface. Your nervous system does not store reality, it filters it. You experience only what is relevant for survival and coherence. Colors are not properties of light, they are interpretations. Time is not a thing, it is a structuring of experience. Even the sense of now is a construction. Neuroscience shows that your conscious present lags behind physical events, and yet experience feels immediate. This suggests that consciousness operates in a different register than physical causality.
Some physicists have begun to wonder whether consciousness is related to the collapse of complexity into simplicity. Experience takes an astronomically complex universe and renders it as a single moment, a single feeling, a single thought. This compression is remarkable. It is as if the universe folds itself inward to produce experience. Information becomes meaning. Quantity becomes quality. This transformation is not described anywhere in physics textbooks, yet it happens constantly. There's another unsettling angle. If awareness participates in reality, then observation is not neutral. What you attend to matters. Not because thoughts magically change the universe in a naive sense, but because attention determines which information becomes real for you, and which remains unrealized. On a cosmic scale, this may be insignificant. On a local scale, it is everything. Entire worlds exist for you only insofar as you are aware of them. In that sense, your universe is literally shaped by what you can know. This leads to a quiet but profound inversion. Instead of consciousness emerging from matter, matter may be a stable pattern within consciousness-like processes. Not human consciousness, but something more primitive and distributed. A proto-awareness, a capacity for experience. Your mind would then be a localized intensification of a universal property, much like a whirlpool is a localized pattern in water. The whirlpool is real, but it is not separate from the water. When it disappears, the water remains. If this analogy holds, then death is not the annihilation of awareness, but the dissolution of a pattern. The universe does not lose its capacity to experience, it loses one particular configuration. From the universe's perspective, nothing fundamental is gone. From the individual perspective, everything is. This asymmetry mirrors the quantum measurement problem itself. Globally, the wave function evolves smoothly. Locally, collapse feels abrupt and absolute. At this depth, asking whether the universe is aware of you may be too narrow. The deeper question is whether awareness is the universe's way of being real at all. Without experience, there may be equations, but no actuality. Without observers, there may be laws, but no events. Reality, then, is not a static structure. It is an ongoing interaction between what can happen and what is known to happen. And that interaction is still unfolding. If awareness is the mechanism through which possibility becomes actuality, then the limits of knowledge become physical boundaries, not just intellectual ones. There are things the universe may be incapable of knowing about itself from within certain perspectives. This introduces a kind of internal horizon, similar to the event horizon of a black hole. Beyond it, information exists mathematically but cannot be experienced. Consciousness may be constrained not by what exists, but by what can be integrated into a coherent point of view. In this sense, reality is stratified. Different levels of awareness reveal different versions of the universe, none of them complete, all of them internally consistent. This idea becomes sharper when we examine mathematical realism. Many physicists suspect that mathematical structures exist independently of the physical universe, and that reality instantiates only a subset of them. But experience adds a twist. Consciousness does not encounter mathematics directly, it encounters meaning. Numbers do not feel like anything, yet experience does. If the universe were purely mathematical, experience would be inexplicable. This suggests that the universe is not just a structure, but a structure that can be felt from the inside. Awareness may be the internal dimension of physical law, the part that equations describe from the outside but never enter. There's a growing suspicion among some researchers that the universe operates more like a self-consistent story than a machine. In such a system, events are constrained not only by past causes, but by global coherence.
Quantum experiments already hint at this. Outcomes seem to respect consistency across time, even when causality appears blurred. Consciousness, which naturally integrates past, present, and anticipated future into a single narrative, may mirror this deeper principle. The universe does not just evolve, it maintains intelligibility, and intelligibility requires a point of view. At the furthest edge of this idea lies a possibility that science rarely voices directly, that existence without experience is incomplete, not false, not impossible, just unfinished. The universe, left alone, may be a vast field of lawful potential. Experience is what turns potential into presence, not once, but continuously. Each moment of awareness does not add something new to the universe, it finalizes something that was waiting to be real. At this depth, the boundary between physics and metaphysics stops being clean, not because science has failed, but because it has succeeded too well. It has reduced reality to relationships, symmetries, and information, and in doing so, it has stripped away the comforting solidity of things. What remains is structure without substance, form without intrinsic content, unless experience supplies it. Consciousness may be the only place where structure acquires presence. Outside of experience, reality is describable. Inside experience, it becomes actual. This difference is subtle but enormous. Description is not existence. A map is not the territory unless someone can stand somewhere. One implication almost no one likes to confront is that objectivity might be a collective achievement rather than a fundamental given. What we call the real world could be the overlap between many perspectives, stabilized through shared information. This would explain why science works best when observations are reproducible and communicable. Reality, in this sense, thickens where perspectives converge. Lonelier regions of the universe, places never observed, never interacted with, may exist only weakly as probabilities rather than facts, not unreal, but underdetermined. Existence could come in degrees. This also reframes intelligence. Intelligence is often defined as problem-solving ability, but that definition ignores something essential: relevance. Consciousness does not merely compute, it filters what matters. Out of infinite possible distinctions, experience selects a few as significant. This act of selection is not random, it is shaped by survival, coherence, and meaning. Meaning itself may be a physical phenomenon, a constraint that reduces informational overload into livable reality. Without such constraints, the universe would be perfectly lawful and utterly uninhabitable. There is a curious resonance here with thermodynamics. Entropy tends to increase, pushing systems toward disorder, yet living systems locally reverse entropy by exporting it elsewhere. Consciousness might be doing something analogous on the informational level. It creates islands of experiential order within a sea of possibility. These islands are temporary, fragile, and costly, but they exist. Your awareness is one such island, a pocket where the universe briefly becomes legible to itself. Some theorists have begun to speculate that experience corresponds to the integration of information across irreducible boundaries. Wherever information becomes unified in a way that cannot be decomposed without loss, something like awareness may arise. This would mean consciousness is not rare, it is constrained. It appears wherever complexity crosses a certain threshold of integration. The human brain is one example, but not necessarily the only one. Other forms may exist that do not resemble minds as we understand them, yet still possess interiority. If that is the case, then the universe may be saturated with proto-experiences, not thoughts, not feelings, but raw potential for interiority. Most of it never coheres, most of it never organizes, but occasionally conditions align. Structures form that can model themselves, anticipate outcomes, and remember. At that point, the universe stops being purely external. It develops an inside. This makes the role of memory especially strange. Memory is not just storage of past data, it is the creation of continuity. Without memory, there is no self, only disconnected moments. Memory stitches time together from the inside. Physics can describe time as a dimension, but it cannot explain why moments feel linked. That linkage may be the work of consciousness alone. Time as lived may not be fundamental, it may be an artifact of awareness maintaining coherence across change. And if time as experienced is constructed, then the present moment becomes extraordinary. The present is where possibility collapses into actuality, where information becomes experience. It is the only place where the universe is fully real for someone. The past is recorded, the future is constrained, but the present is enacted. Every conscious moment is a microscopic completion of the universe's otherwise unfinished state. At this point, it becomes difficult to say where the universe ends and where experience begins. The division may be practical, not ontological, like the division between a wave and the ocean, useful for navigation, meaningless at depth. What you call your mind may be a localized curvature in a much larger field of awareness-like processes, stable for a while, structured, then changing. And the deeper one looks, the less this appears accidental.
As this picture deepens, causality itself begins to feel less rigid than we assume. In everyday thinking, causes precede effects in a clean chain, but in quantum physics, causality is often contextual. Outcomes depend not only on initial conditions, but on how questions are asked. The universe seems responsive to inquiry, not just to force. This is not intention in the human sense, but it is responsiveness. Reality does not unfold blindly, it unfolds relationally. What happens depends on what can be known and how that knowledge is structured. This reframes uncertainty. Uncertainty is not merely ignorance waiting to be removed. It may be a necessary feature of a universe that allows experience at all. A perfectly determined universe would leave no room for perspective. Everything would be fixed, complete, and internally inaccessible. Experience requires openness, gaps where alternatives coexist until one is lived. Indeterminacy, then, is not a flaw. It is a condition for awareness. The universe may remain unfinished on purpose, not by intention, but by necessity. Notice how closely this mirrors creativity. Conscious thought does not proceed by strict deduction alone. Insight often arrives as a collapse, many vague possibilities suddenly resolving into clarity. Before that moment, the idea exists in a superposed state, half-formed, ambiguous, unstable. Then, suddenly, it becomes definite. This resemblance between thought and quantum behavior may not be superficial. Consciousness could be reenacting, at a different scale, the same dynamics that govern reality itself. This raises an unsettling possibility about freedom. If awareness participates in selecting outcomes, then free will may not be an illusion layered onto determinism. It may be a localized expression of quantum openness constrained by structure. Not unlimited choice, but real choice within boundaries. The universe provides possibilities, awareness navigates them. Neither alone is sufficient. Determinism without experience is empty. Experience without constraint is chaos. At this level, even language begins to feel inadequate. Words imply objects, categories, separations. But what is being described here is process, continuous, relational, unfinished. Consciousness is not a thing you have, it is something that happens, a verb, not a noun. And the universe, likewise, may not be a thing that exists, but an activity that continues. Being is doing. Reality is participation. What makes this especially strange is that none of it violates physics. The equations remain intact, the predictions still work. What changes is the interpretation of what those equations are about. Instead of describing a dead world observed from the outside, they may be describing the outer surface of an inner process. Physics gives us the grammar.
Experience supplies the voice. And the more closely one listens, the harder it becomes to believe that awareness is a late, accidental byproduct of matter. It feels more like a quiet requirement, something the universe must allow if it is to be anything at all.
If awareness is woven into the universe rather than pasted onto it, then the question of meaning stops being optional. Meaning is not something humans invent to cope with an indifferent cosmos. It is something that arises wherever experience arises. The universe may not care in the human sense, but it may register. And registering is already a form of awareness. When information becomes experience, the universe is no longer just happening, it is being felt. That alone changes everything. At the deepest scale we can currently imagine, reality may be composed of events rather than objects, not particles sitting in space, but interactions giving rise to structure. Conscious moments fit naturally into this picture. Each moment of experience is an event where vast physical processes converge into something singular and lived. From the outside, it looks like neural activity. From the inside, it is a world. Physics describes the convergence. Experience is the convergence. This dual description may be unavoidable. Any complete account of reality might require two complementary views, one external, one internal. Remove either, and something essential is lost. Without physics, experience floats without constraint. Without experience, physics describes a universe no one ever inhabits. The fact that both exist together may not be accidental. It may be the minimal condition for a universe that is both lawful and present. At some point, depth stops adding clarity and starts adding humility. The closer we get to the foundations of reality, the less it behaves like an object to be mastered, and the more it behaves like a process to be participated in. Consciousness does not stand above the universe asking questions. It stands within it, shaped by it, while simultaneously shaping what becomes real for it. Observer and observed fold into each other until the distinction becomes more practical than true. So when we ask whether the universe is aware of you, the most careful answer may be this. Awareness is not something the universe points at you from the outside. It is something the universe is doing as you, briefly, locally, imperfectly, but genuinely. Your thoughts do not command reality. They do not need to. They are already part of the mechanism by which reality becomes definite, moment by moment. And perhaps that is enough to sit with. Not a final answer, not a solved mystery. Just the recognition that the universe may not be a silent stage on which consciousness accidentally appeared, but an unfinished process that, through awareness, becomes real to itself.